let's get the skeletal system on its way. All right, now this next set of material for exam number 2 starts right here. From here on out, it's going to cover the skeletal system, the articulations, as well as muscles and muscle contractions. That's basically where we're going for exam 2. Usually what we just covered and then what we're about to cover is all on one exam. So we did break it up so that you had a little bit more concentration of information. So today we're going to talk about bones, basically, and more towards the structure and the function of the bones. An outline that we have is we're going to talk about bones, the classification and anatomy of bones. We'll also talk about ossification, how bones harden, and then maintaining homeostasis and promoting bone growth, as well as we have that aging of skeleton system and bone markings. Now there is a section 2 that now in the lab we're talking about bones, and so you may see some repeat, or there may be a point in time where I just kind of like skim over it because this is what we're covering in lab, and I will let you know if that's the case when we get to that part. So first off, just some basic concepts of bone. Really neat thing about bone is that it is living tissue. It's constantly remodeling itself. It's constantly building itself. So that's a really cool thing about it. It doesn't just stay stagnant. It's also composed mainly of osseous connective tissue, meaning that it is that connective tissue, and osseous is coming from the term of bone. And then we have ligaments, tendons, cartilage, and other connective tissue that helps connect and stabilize these bones. If we were to just put these bones together and have them standing freewheelingly, they would all fall apart. They wouldn't have the articulations or the joints. And so we do need these other connective tissues to be able to, as connective tissue does, support and connect things. We also have an average of 206 bones in an adult human body. Now that can differ, but a newborn will have over 300 bones. And that is because these newborns have not gone through the ossification process of their bones. Now we have some functions of the bones, and with that, the first one, there we go. First one is going to be that it is going to support and protect. Oops. Again. Support and protect. And we want to support and protect those more delicate organs. We don't want those just floating around and having things where they're just going to get hammered there, right? That's why we have the ribs to kind of protect some of our vital organs like our heart or even our kidneys. Then we have movement, and movement can't occur unless we have bones to move because of the muscles that move the bones. So movement is another one. Then we have hemopoiesis. Okay, and hemopoiesis is when we have a production of blood cells. Okay, it's like we have the blood and we have these cells that are present, and we need to create more blood cells. And this is done via hemopoiesis, and it's done in the red bone marrow of the mineral and energy reserves. Oh, sorry, that was the next one. It looked like it was hot put off to the side there. Sorry. So then there's the hemopoiesis, that's the blood production of cells in the red bone marrow. And then we have mineral storage. There we go. That sounded funny saying it even. So mineral storage is basically where we're going to have minerals being stored. And this is where it's going to be like calcium and that phosphate that we see there. And we also have lipid storage. So this is two separate ones if you wanted to separate them, or you could have it just as storage in general. So you could do mineral storage here with the calcium and phosphate, and then you could do lipid storage, or you can erase this and say storage of calcium and phosphate and storage of lipids. Your choice on how it helps you remember it. Moving forward. So the structure of the bone. Now, it's composed of several different types of bone cells. We talked about the different cells that were present in our integumentary and our histology section, but we have different cells that are present in just the bones. They are embedded in a matrix of ground substance, as well as inorganic salts. So that's that calcium and that phosphorus that pops up. And then also two collagenous fibers. And if we think about the collagen fibers, those are really tough, strong fibers that we have present. The bone cells and the ground substance as a combination is what gives rise to the flexibility, okay? And we also are going to have the inorganic salts that are present, which give its hardness. So the combination of those two are then going to allow for flexibility, but then strength and hardiness. And there's a beautiful balance between having a little bit of flexibility and having strength as well, because we want them to be strong. We don't want them to be brittle and breaking, but we also want a little bit of movement and a little bit of give. And that's the awesome part, is that combination allows for it to happen. If you're trying to figure out what inorganic means, inorganic basically means it's without carbon. So anytime, excuse me, anytime you come across organic, like organic chemistry revolves around carbon. Anytime you hear organic in the sense of science terms, it should involve carbon. So this inorganic salts is basically where there aren't going to be carbons present. There's 4 different bone cells, and these bone cells are known as osteoprogenitor cells. We also have osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts. Osteoprogenitor cells, osteoblasts, and osteocytes. In class. Sorry, I think I said that twice. So those are the 4 different bone cells that are present in bone. Here's a description of each of those. So we have the osteoprogenitor cells. These are also known as osteogenic. This is basically where it plays a role in repair and growth, okay? And it gives rise to osteoblasts. Now, osteoblasts are bone building. So that B should remind you of bone building. Osteoblasts are bone building. And basically what they do is they synthesize and secrete this unmineralized ground substance, and this is known as osteoid, and then it traps these osteocytes. And the osteocytes are essentially mature cells of the bone. And so basically it goes from it's like the osteoblasts, they're going to school and they're building on their education, and then they become mature and they graduated and now they're osteocytes, and then they're trapped. But they have all that education, they're mature in that sense. And so this is what is going to help, because they're going to secrete all that information that they know. And for the bones, the osteocytes are secreting enzymes, and they're influencing the bone mineral content. This is what's going to help keep that bone healthy. Now, this next one may seem like we shouldn't have it, but it's a critical role that our bones do need. Osteoclasts. The C should remind you of being a bone crusher. They're going to crush those cells. They're going to break down the tissue, this bone tissue, because it is connective tissue. And by doing that, it releases these minerals that we were talking about, that calcium, that phosphate. And then there's other minerals that are also involved, but it all goes to the blood. So by crushing these bones up and then having our bone builders next to it, this is what allows for our bones to grow and develop. So it's really important that we have all of these bones present. Now, the osteoclasts, they are multinucleated, so they have many nuclei, and then they're also phagocytic cells. And that kind of makes sense for it being a bone crusher. They're actually going to be cell-eating cells. So that's how they break down the bone. Here are some images. I know we have some visuals in the class, and so here are some images of those bone cells. We have those osteoprogenitor cells, okay? And those osteoprogenitor cells then develop to be those osteoblasts. And once they are then going through school, they're ready to mature and graduate, they become an osteocyte. And that osteocyte is then mature and it gets trapped within the bone. And then we have some osteoclasts that are present over here that are then going to kind of deteriorate or crush that bone up. They're going to eat it up.
Sorry, Danny, I have a question.
Yeah.
So it's just like a cycle that it goes through?
Pretty much. Yep. But there are different stages. So those 4 different types of cells that are present are at different stages of it.
Okay, so there's always like one of each, but they're all going through through that same stage at different times?
Yeah, because you can't have all of them in the same stage or else we wouldn't grow. So they're all going to be at different stages because some of them are going to break it down while others are building it. So it's a constant ebb and flow between them. It's kind of a checks and balance system.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. All righty, now we're getting into how bones look. So we're going to talk about these structures real quick. If we were to look right over here, maybe I can bring it over. Why am I not being able to? Okay, here we have those osteoprogenitor cells. So those beginning cells that are then going to turn into the osteoblasts. These are those bone builders. They're trying to build it on up. And then the osteoclasts are here, and they're the ones that are going to be trying to crush it to be able to then have building occur or growth occur there. And then here we have those osteocytes that are going to be kind of trapped inside of that cell or that bone tissue. We see them right in here. So that's just an image. If you wanted to look at it again, we have the osteocyte over here with that lacunae as well. They kind of look like these spiders, those osteocytes that are inside of the lamellae. Now let's talk about bone matrix. Well, bone matrix is basically going to be made up of 2 components, the organic components. Remember, organics means that a carbon is present. And then there's inorganic components. So the organic components are going to be making up about 1/3 of the mass of the bone. And it consists of those cells, those collagen fibers, and the ground substance. Now, this portion is what allows for some flexibility in the bones, but gives bones its tensile strength. And I'm going to talk about tension here and forces on the bone in just a moment. So the organic components are cells, collagen fibers, and ground substances. Now, the inorganic components, meaning that there's no carbon present, is going to be basically this hydroxyapatite. That is essentially crystals. And these crystals are formed by calcium phosphate and calcium hydroxide. If you want to get super nitty-gritty on it, this is what it is. And this hydroxyapatite is essential for bone and teeth health. It gives them rigidity. Now, there's also going to be calcium carbonate, sodium, magnesium, sulfate, and fluoride. And it is going to be used in the process of what is known as calcification. Calcification of bone. Calcification of bone.
So Danny, inorganic components, is that just what makes the bones stronger? Or
It gives it's not the strength. The strength comes from the organic components,
okay.
and the inorganic is what gives it the rigidity of it. So it allows for some kind of, it still has strength because the organic, but it gives it for the health, the overall health of it, the longevity of it.
Okay.
And then Danny, what did you say about 1/3 of what on the organic components?
Oh, it makes up about 1/3 of the mass of bone. So
Okay.
a third of the bone will be composed of these items, these organic items.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
And then I think someone had a question in the chat.
Oh, okay. Why do we need bone rebuilding? Oh, we're going to talk about that here just a moment. So Jocelyn, hang tight on that question, okay? Bone rebuilding is definitely important. I'll just give a little preview for growth, basically. You're welcome. Okay, now, I know I just said that it doesn't really give, it gives towards longevity and that rigidity, the inorganic components. And that is because we have tensile strength and then we have compressional strength. And so this will tie into just a moment here, but the inorganic is then going to help with the compressional strength, okay? So this is where we're going to have that longevity, and hopefully it'll make sense in just a moment when I give examples as to these forces that get applied to the bones. Okay, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Here we go. There are different forces that are applied on our bones. Now we have this as, imagine this as our bone right here. And there's actually another one that I'll talk about too that's not pictured here, but we have different forces that are applied on the bone. This happens all the time. This happens when we're moving, when we're sitting, when we're doing anything and everything in our daily lives. Imagine this as bone. And then imagine this is tensile forces, meaning that the forces are being pulled in opposite directions. So we need strength there that they're not going to just like pull apart. That's where that organic component comes in, right? But the inorganic component comes from the compressional forces. And remember how I said the longevity and the rigidity, like it's going to be able to be within that box. We don't really want it to break apart its structure. That's because, for instance, like if you go to the gym and you do a barbell squat, let's say a back squat. When you do a barbell back squat, you have all this weight right on your shoulders with that barbell. And then you go into a squat. Well, what ends up happening is that the forces are pressing those vertebrae to be squeezing together. So we want it to be strong, but we also want it to be rigid because of the fact that we don't want it to just smash together. So that's where the rigidity and that strength, that's what I was trying to get at in the difference of it. This is to withstand that compression that's occurring. And the barbell squat is probably one of the better ones to use as an example, just for the sake that the load, especially if you're getting up there on that weight, you're putting extra load on your bones and your vertebrae. And then there's also torsional forces, or what's known as torque. Now this is like swinging a baseball bat, or perhaps you're going to throw a punch, or whatever the case may be, you're rotating. Now I'm using a lot of examples that are on the spine. That's just because it's a little bit easier for us to understand with the spine and then how it moves. So the torsional or torque forces are going to be in rotation. And then the last one that I don't have featured here, but it is there just to solidify all of the different types of forces, especially on the spine, is shear. It's known as shear forces, and that's basically if you go in one direction and then the opposite direction. So when you do like like a side plank, and people will do the dips. Like if you're on the ground here and you're like dipping and it's like going back and forth your body, you're having your vertebrae kind of go back and forth on that shear tension. Now, I will say that this tension is able to be done with the spine in particular. But if we're able to avoid some of those movements, then we can allow for when the body needs to do those movements to have longevity with it, if that makes sense.
Sorry, I have a question.
Yeah.
So you said the compression was like, for example, squatting,
Mhm.
and then the rotation was swinging. What was the tensile again?
Tensile is going in opposing directions. So that's like if you're like pulling on something, this would also be with some growth here. Tensile, you don't normally see. Like when you look at biomechanical research, the research doesn't really look at tensile forces because this is really tough to do. This would be like as if you're like pulling on it. Instead, with biomechanical, meaning like how our body moves in kinesiology and the joints, you'll see much more of that shear tension I was talking about, the compressional and the torque. So that doesn't really give you a straight answer as to an example. It's just that there's not very many examples for it.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. So just like any other part, oh, we got some chat coming in. You know, stretching is going to be much more of muscles that we do. Like when we stretch, we're stretching our muscles. Now, if there is a muscle that is perhaps in the shortened phase, like if you had, let's say just the body naturally is in a shortened phase, it can lengthen so far, and then you're pulling on it by trying to lengthen it, maybe that will pull on it a little bit for tensile forces, but stretching's mainly for the muscles. And so there's not really a way for us to like grab the bone and stretch it out. Yeah, it's kind of tough to do that tensile force. All right, as mentioned, we had the macroscopic and the microscopic. And of course, in anatomy, we got to look at the microscopic. Macroscopic would basically be looking at the bones, like we did in lab, or we will do in lab tonight. Microscopic is looking at the inside of those bones and what it is composed of. So there's two microscopic types of bone structure, and that is going to be the spongy bone, and that will also be compact bone. We have to have both of these components. We can't just have one or the other. Now, the spongy bone, kind of like its name, is like a sponge. Yes, Jessica. Oops, sorry about that. Here we go. Hold on. Compact bones. There we go. So spongy bone, like its name, is an open lattice. It looks like sponges. And this is known as trabeculae, that real spongy open lattice kind of look, this network almost. There's a lot of blood present here, and that is needed for that bone growth to occur. This is where, because of that networking or that lattice, it provides strength, just like that reticular fibers. When we talked about the reticular fibers, it allowed for flexibility, but it still provided strength. This is the same kind of concept here with spongy bone. It provides the strength that we want, but because there's space in between, it means it's not going to be very heavy, at least that part of it. Now, there's also compact bone, and compact bone is where, just like it says, it's compact. It's going to be like all dense in there, squished in. It is relatively dense. It's solid. We want compact bone because we want it to be strong. We want it to be able to withstand whatever we put it through. And so the external surfaces of these long and flat bones, there's different kinds of bones that we'll talk about. These long bones, like your femur, it's a really long bone there. Probably it's the longest bone in your body, unless you got some abnormal humerus bones in their length. And flat bones, it's going to be the outside of it. And the reason why we have it in two different types like this is because of the fact that we don't want the bones to be too heavy. If you can imagine, our body's already pretty heavy. Now, if we were to have just completely compact bones, that would be super heavy. All right, we're gonna break each of these components down. So I have it kind of like spelled out for the rest of it, all right? What we have are, let's go into this one. We have spongy bone. So I'm kind of recapping from what we were talking about, spongy versus compact. And the spongy bone does not have osteons present. We're gonna talk about osteons in just a moment. So it does not have osteons. The trabeculae, that lattice that we were just talking about, contains parallel lamellae. There we go. Parallel lamellae. Lamellae are just like those rings that we saw in lab, how there's all of those rings like a tree trunk. If they were to cut a tree down, those are the lamellae. And it has a network of trabeculae, which provides that resistance. We talked about how the reticular fibers do the same thing, that network, that mesh, that provides that resistance to stresses, and it allows it because of the fact that it's applied in many directions. So this is part of that spongy bone. Now the compact bone is going to have the osteons. And these osteons, which are not present in spongy bone, they're present in compact bone. These are the basic unit of the compact bone. So this is kind of like the main structural point here, these osteons. These are the ones that are like those little rings that you would find. So you have the large rings, the years, when you would count the years of the trees, and then you would have those little knots that are in it. These are kind of those knots, if you will. They're cylindrical structures, and they run parallel to the diaphysis. Now, the diaphysis is this part right here. It's basically the shaft of the bone. So they run parallel to those. This right here is an osteon. This right here is an osteon, another osteon. So notice that we have lots of these circles that can continue to repeat. And then we can see that the osteon has all these subsections right here. We're going to talk about those. So the osteons are those basic units of compact bone. They also are cylindrical and they run parallel to the diaphysis, to the shaft. They're kind of like a nucleus, if you will. Then we have the lamellae. Oh, no, there we go. The lamellae are basically these rings. Those are the years that you count when a tree has been cut. These are the rings of the bone, and they're around the central canal. Okay, so the central canal basically carries those vessels and nerves. If we think about just the name, central means in the middle, canal means it's like an opening or like a hole. And whenever we have that opening, we're going to have something that fills it. Well, our blood vessels is what fills it, as well as our nerves. This is that central canal right here with those veins, arteries, and nerves inside of it. So it's like that hole that you see right here. Around it, see these lines that make other holes, or like even like a cinnamon roll, where you have all those rolls around the cinnamon roll where it keeps wrapping around. Those are the lamellae, those rings. Then we have the lacunae. And these are spaces between the lamellae, and these are containing osteocytes. Remember, those are the mature cells that are present. The lacunae, it's kind of like a cocoon cocoon lacunae. They sound similar too. And we look at it, the osteocyte's in the center here. It's kind of this dark, may not be able to see it as we're right here, but there it is. There's that osteocyte inside there. The lacunae is around it, kind of this outside bubble. Then we have canaliculi. Canaliculi. These are basically these small channels of, they're like branches off of the lacunae. And these branches are then going to allow for nutrients to essentially be traveling from one to another. And it travels from the central canals to the osteocytes and back. So that's where that osteocyte, that mature bone cell, it needs nutrients. It needs to be able to continue to eat, if you will, to be able to continue to give its education or its knowledge out, right? If we think about our mature student going through and it's graduated and it's stuck here, it needs nutrients. And these nutrients go over to the blood that's in that central canal to receive all those nutrients to then pull back to serve the osteocyte. Yes, thank you, Cindy. All right, now a little bit further of those compact bone. These are the last two. We have the perforating canals. Now you may see these as the Volkmann canals. That's another term for it. Again, whenever you see kind of like a funky name like that, Volkmann, that's essentially someone named it. And these canals are going to run perpendicular. So the lamellae is going to run parallel. These run perpendicular to the central canals. This is essentially what allows for the osteons to be connected via a blood vessels and nerves network. The perforating canals are from right here to right here. So here's that central canal, which makes sense. It's in the center. And this perforating canals are what's connecting each of those. Do we see that? How it's the horizontal piece.
What is it connecting?
Each of the central canals. And this is what's providing. It's not like we have just like one vessel going here, another one vessel going here, and that's it. They travel up, but they also travel between each other. So this is how we don't just have a single source of nutrients coming to those osteocytes and those osteons, because the osteon is this whole ring. We have them sharing with each other and supplying each of those osteons. Osteon is that whole central region right there, that structure. And lastly, we have circumferential lamellae. There we go. And these circumferential, like circumference, are going to be rings, but these rings, kind of like the other lamellae that we were talking about that surround inside of that osteon, these ones are on the outside, on the circumference. We have all those osteons with the lamellae, making those cinnamon rolls, the shapes of it. And then we have the external circumferential lamellae. These are going to be rings of bone located immediately deep to the periosteum or deep to the endosteum. This is going to be on the perimeter. Here are some images of those microscopic views of the bone. Here we have that central canal, that big old hole that's in the middle. This is where those blood vessels and nerves would be. That's why if you break a bone, it hurts. It's not just bone. We have those blood vessels and we have those nerves present to make it uncomfortable if you break it. And then we have the lamellae that's going around. We have the lacunae that have those osteocytes present inside of it. And then those are going to also have the canaliculi that are going to talk basically to the central canal to bring in those nutrients to the osteocytes. Let's talk about the macroscopic view of bones. Now, we have all of these structures right here. We're going to go through each of them. Okay, so here's that list for you already. We have the epiphysis, the diaphysis, the medullary cavity, epiphyseal line, epiphyseal plate, the periosteum, endosteum, articular cartilage, nutrient foramina, compact and spongy bone. And I have slides for each of these, breaking them down. First one, we have the epiphysis. Now the epiphysis is basically on the distal and the proximal end. I had those backwards if we're looking superior and inferior view. So our proximal end and our distal end, the epiphysis are the ends here. And this is in a long bone, so like our femur or our humerus. It strengthens the joints. That's the purpose of it. And it's also usually the site for attachment with our muscles. And the way that we attach muscles to bone is via tendons. And then it's also a site for attachment of other bones via ligaments. Sometimes we want some bones to attach to each other in order to create that joint and not just rely on the muscles to do it, to have the movement. So the epiphysis is going to be over here as well as over here. Then we have the diaphysis. The diaphysis is just the shaft. It's the big part of the bone. It's kind of like the body of it. The medullary cavity. Now the medullary cavity is, a cavity is hollow or a space. Whenever you hear cavity in anatomy, it's basically a space. And that's what this is. It's a hollow, cylindrical, kind of like a circular hole or space that's in the diaphysis, in this shaft. We can see that this space that's in here, if we were to look past all of these veins and arteries here, that is where the blood vessels and nerves are present, is going to be in this medullary cavity. And in adults, it is going to contain yellow bone marrow. Now we have the epiphyseal line and the epiphyseal plate. These are different. Now the epiphyseal line is the line of fusion where growing regions of bones unite. In adults, the plate is replaced with the epiphyseal line because the epiphyseal plate is the region of cartilage between epiphyses. And the diaphysis in bone is still growing. So that means that if we're having adolescents or children or young adults who are still growing, we're going to have an epiphyseal plate. But once you've stopped growing, you actually now have the epiphyseal line. That means there isn't going to be any more growth going on because this cartilage that was once at that epiphyseal line has now ossified and fused with the bone. So it actually will no longer allow for that growth to occur. And this is where those osteocytes or osteoclasts and osteoblasts need to be present. We want the osteoclast to break down or to crush these parts of bone so we can continue to have them build and get them longer. The periosteum, this is going to be dense connective tissue. So dense connective tissue that basically surrounds the outside of the bone. Okay, this is going to be that periosteum. You see it kind of peeling off right there. Okay, Lily, let's go back to that last slide. Epiphyseal line and epiphyseal plate. The epiphyseal plate is going to be this region that can continue to grow because it is cartilage. It has not ossified, it has not hardened. We have an epiphyseal line like right in here. Okay, you can't quite see it here. And I think there's another image later on that can show you that line a little bit better. When it's a plate, it's cartilage at this location. And essentially it's where the diaphysis, this shaft, and the epiphysis are going to meet together, that epiphyseal plate. And in between there, that where that epiphyseal plate is going to be cartilage. So it allows it to continue to grow because it's still soft. But the moment that you've stopped growing and you will no longer grow, you will create an epiphyseal line there. You'll actually see a distinct line in the imaging. And that line will indicate that you will no longer grow.
Okay, so the epiphyseal plate comes first and then okay, that's where I was confused.
Yep. I'm glad that
Then
we
it turns
covered
into
that.
a line.
Yeah,
Okay.
it starts as a plate and then the line is kind of like the remnants of the plate. Like that's a reminder that you were growing.
Thank you so much. That helps.
Yeah, you're welcome. Kaylin, okay, when I was younger, I fractured a growth plate in my ankle. Would late be considered an epiphyseal plate? So if it no longer had its service to continue to grow, then yes, it could definitely transition from that epiphyseal plate to an epiphyseal line. Does that help clarify it, Kaylin? So sometimes damage or structural issues can inhibit the growth, and it can actually disrupt some of this ability to grow. And therefore that's where like that cartilage would start to harden, just because cartilage too doesn't tend to be very vascular. And so if you do have damage to that tissue, it can harden a bit, making it very challenging for it to grow. So it might have been kind of like a back door to creating an epiphyseal line. All right, we were talking about the periosteum. That's just that sheet that wraps around the bone. It's kind of like that superficial layer on the bone. And then the endosteum, whenever you see endo or end, that means kind of within. It's like the inner lining. We have like the endometrium of the uterus. That is the innermost lining. And this is the same kind of concept. We have that end, and then osteum is going to be towards bone. So this is the inner lining of the marrow cavity. Remember when we had that cavity we were talking about, the medullary cavity, which contains yellow bone marrow? This is going to be the endosteum. If we were to look inside, here we go. Right here. So the inner layer is that endosteum, whereas the periosteum is this outer layer. And then lastly, for this slide at least, we have the articular cartilage. Hopefully you're thinking articular, that means that bones are articulating or coming together, they're meeting together, creating a joint. This is essentially hyaline cartilage. And it's located specifically on the surfaces that are going to be articulating for the bone. And this is essentially connecting one bone to the next. Is the articular cartilage. And you can see down here, it's kind of this like softer looking, a little bit of white right there. That is that articular cartilage on that distal end of the femur, because that's where it's going to meet with the tibia. Now, the last sections of the macroscopic bone is the nutrient foramina, compact and spongy bone. Luckily, we've already kind of talked about that compact and spongy bone, but nutrient foramina is, if we break down the term nutrient, we got to have some kind of nutrient. For us, we think of nutrients like our food. And this is the same kind of concept for the bone. Nutrients coming in, it's whatever is going to feed it or fuel it to be able to perform. And foramina means that it's holes. So a foramen is a singular hole, but foramina are many holes. So the nutrient foramina are small holes that allow for those nutrients to be able to be presented via the blood vessels. And that's always going to be the case in our body. Nutrients are delivered via blood, and they can only be delivered via blood through vessels. And that's kind of like, we can't get from place to place. We don't go on a horse and carriage anymore. We go on cars. Our cars travel on freeways. Well, the blood vessels are like the freeways or the roads, and then the nutrient being the car that is delivering to that location. Compact bone, we said that was that dense bone forming walls on the diaphysis, diaphysis being the central region, the body or the shaft, and then the spongy bone. Oh, and also it's made of osteons. The spongy bone is going to contain that trabeculae, that lattice-like structure, and this is found on the ends. And you can kind of see how it's a little bit holy over here. That's that lattice work. That's that lattice work where we see a lot more structure. It's not, or that compact, dense structure looking. It's not as holy as it is up on the ends.
Excuse me, Danny. So what was the trabecula?
Trabeculae is that lattice-like. Let's move on in right over here. It's just kind of like this network, this mesh that we see all throughout there. It's kind of like that reticular fibers. Remember how the reticular fibers was a network there that made it strong but flexible? The trabeculae does the same thing, but for bone.
Okay, thank you for
You're
explaining.
welcome. Here we go. Bone development. Now, bone formation begins about week 4 of the embryonic development. We're going to talk so much more about embryonic development way down the line. But I do try to sprinkle here and there just so that you can see how early on this starts happening. It does happen about the week 4 of embryonic development, which basically is at the point in time where you may or may not even know that someone's pregnant. And this is like coming up to the point where like you're going to be missing your period soon. That's how soon we're talking. But it isn't observed until week 8. So this is going to be more towards that 2nd month of pregnancy that this ossification or this bone development is going to be occurring. The formation of bone is known as ossification right here. Ossification, or what is also known as osteogenesis, creation, genesis, and osteo being bone. This is going to be the development of that bone connective tissue. Remember, bone is connective tissue. We already talked about that in our histology section. Now there's 2 different patterns. The first pattern is going to be our intramembranous ossification. Intra means within. Inter means between. So that's where you got to be really careful. Intramembranous is intra being within. What's the reference point? Membranous, so it's going to be within the membrane. Then we have also the endochondral ossification. Endo is also that inner lining. And these are going to be in 2 different styles. So the intramembranous ossification basically produces our flat bones. And the examples of those are the skull, we have facial bones, our mandible right here, our lower jaw, and then also too our clavicle, the central portion. So our clavicle is this bone right here. You can palpate it on both sides. And those are our flat bones because they're relatively flat. Now the endochondral, chondral is going back towards that cartilage. That's that word. So endo being inner lining, and then chondral is cartilage. Ossification is that hardening. It begins with hyaline cartilage and it produces most of the rest of the bones. And most of the rest of the bones are going to be basically our appendages, which are the lower and upper limbs. So our appendage right here, and then our legs. We do have some other bones like our sesamoid bone, like our patella, and also irregular bones, but those are kind of a little bit funkier. So these are the two that we're mainly going to focus on. Now, the first one is the intramembranous ossification. What happens is these mesenchymal cells, which are basically stem cells that make and repair skeletal tissue, these are going to be with abundant ground substance, and that condenses into a layer of soft tissue with a strong vascular supply. So there's a lot of blood that's here. Okay, we can see these mesenchymal cells right over here, all over there. These mesenchymal cells are going to differentiate. So they're going to kind of like divide and develop into what's known as osteoprogenitor cells. We talked about osteoprogenitor cells. Those are the beginning cells before they then become those osteoblasts. So these progenitor cells are then going to become osteoblasts. We see the osteoblasts present in here, right through there. Those osteoblasts are going to secrete the matrix, which is followed by calcification. And from there, the trapped osteoblasts within the lamellae become the osteocytes. So this is kind of what we were talking about earlier of that transition of these cells and how they kind of go from one stage to the next. This is a more in-depth process of that. We can see this matrix being secreted by those osteoblasts right over here. And the ones that are in the center end up getting trapped, those osteocytes. And then we see the caniculi and the lacunae that surround those osteocytes. Now from there, the bone is formed from disorganized, or the bone formed is disorganized. And that's because we're talking about those flat bones, like our skull or the central portion of our clavicle. And these calcified trabeculae and intertrabeculae, so inter being between, trabeculae in between the trabeculae, spaces form spongy bone. Here we can see that. Here we have that spongy bone right here, okay? And in between is going to be where we get that calcification that's occurring. So it's kind of like these two layers. On the internal and external surfaces of primary bone, the trabeculae and the spaces are then filled with secondary or lamellular bone. And then this is what forms that compact bone. So we kind of have to have multiple layers on the outside of that trabeculae, because we want the trabeculae to be present to make it light. We don't want it to be completely compact. So it's lighter because the trabeculae that's there. And this is my little motion for the lattice, the lightweight. And we can see that all through here, that spongy bone. And then we see the layers here for that compact bone. Okay. So then the skull bones are formed with two layers of compact bone with a layer of spongy bone between them. That's essentially what ends up happening. Let's talk about the endochondral ossification now. Now the chondral being cartilage, endo being within or that inner, it can also be known as absorbing or containing. Most of the rest of the bones are going to develop this way because we said that the shorter flat bones, those are the ones that have the intramembranous ossification. And because of the fact that we're talking about cartilage here, that chondrule, that means that we have to have a template or a beginning state of cartilage. And that's what we have, hyaline cartilage. That's where it begins. It begins to calcify. It then degenerates within the central portion of the bone, that diaphysis, the shaft. Now, this is going to be called the primary ossification center. This primary ossification center is that degenerated center of the bone shaft. And there's an image coming up, okay, for my visuals. Now, blood vessels and osteoprogenitor cells enter ossification center, this primary ossification center, and they get converted to calcified cartilage into bone. Remember, we had the osteoprogenitor cells that then have the osteoblasts. Those osteoblasts secrete. So this is the same concept here. The blood vessels and the osteoprogenitor cells enter this ossification center, convert and calcify cartilage into bone. Now, the secondary ossification center, which you'll see in just a moment, that centers form in the epiphysis.
Can you go back really quick just to that last slide?
Yeah, for sure. Right here, right?
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, got it.
All right. So that second part here is that the secondary ossification are going to be the epiphyses. So the primary ossification is in the diaphysis, in the shaft. The epiphyses, those ends, that's where the secondary ossification occurs. And osteoclasts resorb bone matrix in the diaphysis. Remember, osteoclasts are bone crushers. Okay, so these bone crushers are going to basically eat up, because they're the big acidic, they're cell eating, they're going to eat up that bone matrix in the diaphysis. And this is what creates that hollow medullary cavity that we saw in our typical macroscopic bone. And then only the articular cartilage and the epiphyseal plate, remember the epiphyseal plate is still cartilage, it's not that line yet, remain cartilage. Upon reaching full height, that epiphyseal plate is then converted into bone, and that's when we call it the epiphyseal line. I'm going to hang here for a second. So first part is that most of the bones develop. I'm just doing a quick recap here. Using this process. So this is the kind of primary process, if you will. Process begins with hyaline cartilage because we're talking about endochondral ossification, and it begins to calcify and then degenerate within the center of the bone, the shaft, the diaphysis, right? This is where that primary ossification occurs, or that ossification center occurs. Blood vessels and osteoprogenitor cells enter this ossification center. And from there, it is then going to convert that calcified cartilage into bone. And then this secondary ossification center in the epiphyses, these ends here, that is going to have the osteoclasts resorb or eat up the bone matrix in that diaphysis, creating that hollow medullary cavity. And then after this, only the articular cartilage and that epiphyseal plate are what's left as cartilage until you've reached your height, and then that epiphyseal plate becomes epiphyseal line. Now, this process can take place at any point in time. The conversion from the cartilage to more of that bone for the epiphyseal line, that can happen. I've seen in males can be as late as like 25. Usually females are a little bit sooner than that. But typically your early 20s is kind of that cap of when you're going to grow. Now, I wish that was the case for me. I hit 5th grade and I was like, "Ooh, I'm the tallest girl." And then from there, I was the shortest girl for there on out. Like I just stopped growing. So some people go sooner than others, and it just kind of happens depending on your genetics. Here is basically that breakdown that we were talking about, each of those sections. Here's that hyaline cartilage. We have that primary ossification center developing here in the middle because we're having that deteriorating cartilage occur, but we're still having some ossification. And then it's still creating those epiphyseal or the epiphyses at the end with the diaphysis in the middle. We can see that medullary cavity coming up, more of that medullary cavity. And we can see the epiphyseal plate, the cartilage is still present. See how the cartilage here, this like blue, it starts shrinking further and further and further. And then over here, we don't have it anymore. So this is that end point where we no longer are growing. I would recommend looking at this, just kind of taking in those images as well as that description we just went over. Just to make sure that you can see that visual with it, okay? But over here in this epiphyses on both sides, that's that secondary ossification center region. Yeah, oh my gosh, Cindy, I'm 5'1". I know I'm short, 5'7", and you're told you're short? Geez, I'm like way behind if that's the case. So here is an example of those epiphyseal lines. We can see that line that gets created here, that line right there. Whereas this one, this is still a young bone. Unfortunately, someone had passed a little bit, oh, tall, okay. I was like, oh my gosh, times have changed. Oh dear. So here we can see that the bone is much smaller and we don't have that line. We have kind of this space here. It looks like a space. That's that epiphyseal plate. And here it's kind of cool. It actually gives you a breakdown. So you can see that, yeah, the latest here is that humerus head, about 23.5. Now, of course, this is general. You can be anywhere outside of those ranges. But we see that with males, the radius 19, the distal part of the radius 22. You know, we're looking at early 20s over here. The clavicle 30 years old. Who would have thought? But the majority of them are going to be in that early 20s, late teens. That's just a fun piece right there. Okay. Bone growth and remodeling. As I said, bone is living tissue. It's constantly growing. This is dynamic tissue. That's basically what they say it as, is dynamic tissue, and it's constantly remodeling throughout its life. They do grow in length and in girth. We do have two types of bone growth. Now we have interstitial growth, and then we also have appositional growth right there. Okay, and then we have bone remodeling. The interstitial growth, this is where it's going to occur within that epiphyseal plate. It increases in length. Where we have chondrocytes, this is where the chondrocytes are going to wall themselves off and die. This is the area that then becomes ossified, which creates new cartilage formed at the ends near those epiphyses. This process is then going to continue until the bone growth ceases, where we stop growing. Puberty, oh gosh, puberty, there we go, third time's a charm. This is where the growth of epiphyseal plates speed up, and that makes sense because you see at puberty, all of a sudden someone will like shoot up, right? They get taller all of a sudden, and usually you see this a lot more in the males, but females it does happen, and this is dependent upon hormones. And so if the hormones are going to be delayed, or if you're not having as much hormones present, then you're not going to have those huge spikes. And the epiphyseal line is a remnant of that cartilaginous epiphyseal plate. It's basically just a far distant memory of it.
Danny, can you go back to that 30-second slide? Yeah,
Right there.
thank you.
Mhm. Okay. So the other type of bone growth is going to be the appositional growth. Okay, appositional growth. Now, this is going to occur within the periosteum. Remember that outer lining of the bone where it kind of wraps around it? And this is going to result in increase of width. Increase of width. So the interstitial growth is going to be in length, whereas the appositional growth is width. We are going to have osteoblasts, bone builders in the periosteum. This is what's going to lay down bone as external circumferential lamellae, that outside lamellae that wraps around all of those osteons. Osteoblasts do that because they're bone builders. But we also have osteoclasts present. We have to have those present in the medullary cavity to be able to eat up that bone and make that hole, that cavity, to have the blood vessels and nerves to be there. And that's just to continue to enlarge in that cavity. Osteoblasts are present and osteoclasts are present. As the bone builds up, we don't want just that tiny little medullary cavity. We have to have big enough nutrients and blood supplies present in order to be able to withstand the demands of that new larger bone. Here's an image of how it kind of progresses into adulthood. Notice here that medullary cavity is quite small. We have it again as a child. You see that growth developing. It's getting bigger, that medullary cavity, because of the osteocytes eating it, or osteoclasts, excuse me, osteoclast being that bone crusher. And then we see that the bone kind of grows outwardly because appositional is width, not the length. That's interstitial growth. And then eventually at the end, we have this larger medullary cavity, which is with a thick ring of bone around it, that compact bone. Bone remodeling, it's the continual production of new bone and reabsorption of old bone. This is known as bone remodeling. It helps maintain that calcium and phosphate level. It is stimulated by stress on the bone. So you do have to have stress. That's where exercise is super important. It places stress on the bone. It causes this bone building and eating to continue to occur. So the moment that you stop exercising, your bones don't have that stress played upon it. And that can deteriorate the bones and stop that production of new bone building. It does occur at different rates depending on the location of the body. Now, maintaining homeostasis and promoting bone growth. Homeostasis is kind of this like constant level. That's what we want to be at. So this constant level is going to be basically growth, maintenance, and repair that will depend on three things. It'll be on hormones. It'll also be on vitamins and exercise. Gotta throw in the exercise there. The hormones are going to be present, especially with females. We have our estrogen that's present. The moment that we start going into menopause, that can play a role in it. If we don't have the correct vitamins being present, that can play a role. If we don't have that calcium being absorbed or being intake through our diet, then we're not going to be able to have the calcium that is needed in that inorganic component of bone. And then, of course, too, exercise, as I mentioned, is a stress that continues to have that bone building and breaking down. So here we have the effects of hormones. Hormones are regulated by those osteoblasts and clasts. So the activity between those bones or those bone cells are going to be dependent upon these 3 hormones. They are going to also regulate calcium levels. First one is IGF. Okay, this is known as your growth hormone insulin. It's kind of like your growth hormone. This stimulates your cartilage growth at that epiphyseal plate. Then you have your thyroid hormone. This is going to be stimulated by your metabolic rate of osteoblasts, converting it to the bone growth. And then lastly, of course, you got to have the sex hormones. Sexual hormone. Let's keep it sex hormones. Sex hormones right there. And the sex hormones are going to be secreted in large amounts at puberty. Hence also why we see a lot of growth occurring at that time frame. And this also because of this spike of these hormones surging through your body, then that's going to be where we get that spike in the growth. It's your growth hormone, the IGF. It's like your growth hormone, insulin growth hormone. Okay, vitamins that are present or needed. These are going to be your vitamin A, C, and D. Now, we probably hear more of vitamin D associated with bones, but vitamin A is very important because it activates those osteoblasts. We also need vitamin C. Vitamin C is very easy to get. You just drink your orange juice, right? But it is required for that collagen synthesis. So that collagen is going to help make it stronger. And then of course too, we have our vitamin D, which stimulates calcium absorption from the GI tract into the blood. And this is what allows calcium to be available for bone formation. Okay. Let's see, do I want to get into this or not yet? You can certainly overdose on vitamins. Vitamin C, you won't necessarily overdose on. You'll just start having a lot of diarrhea, which probably then tells you to stop just for the sake of it. But you definitely can have over the upper limits, and it can be very dangerous to have upper limit vitamin toxicity for sure. That you could get way nitty gritty into in nutrition classes. All right, my thought is hang tight with me for just, oh no, we're so close, but I don't want to get into all that stuff quite yet because the thing is that we'll really get into exercise, and you know me and exercise, I'll like go all crazy. Oh, but you know what? Okay, let me finish off, all right? Because we're so close, and the clinical applications could be more towards you guys going over it on your own. I know you guys like the clinical applications, but at least it'll be present for you, okay? So effects of exercise, this is mechanical stress, as I mentioned. This stimulates that increase in bone density and increased osteoblast activity. Bones of athletes usually become thicker and stronger because of the mechanical stress of exercise played on the bones. Bone loss does occur, the mass of it, with age. But if you exercise, you can slow that process down or even reverse it. So it's really important to exercise. This can be weight-bearing exercise. Running, walking, anything of that sort is actually having repeated stress on those bones. Now, I want to put this out there. One exercise that would not be weight-bearing exercise or stressful on the bones is swimming, because it takes gravity away. So swimming is actually going to reverse those stressful effects on the bone. It's great for low impact, but you need some kind of weight-bearing exercise in order to create this osteoclast cycle to continue. That's where females who go through menopause super, super, super important to exercise, and even better, weightlifting. Weightlifting is probably the best thing for women who are going into menopause or going to be going into menopause. So that's something you just want to kind of be aware of. Now, aging and the skeletal system. During aging, bone changes in two ways. You can lose the ability to produce that organic matrix, but you can also lose calcium and other minerals. Okay, the insufficient ossification is known as osteopenia. This is really important. Osteopenia is the insufficient ossification. This osteopenia can then result in osteoporosis. So there is a first category, the osteopenia, and then osteoporosis is now when we actually have a loss in bone mass. So you can get back that osteopenia state by having exercise and proper nutrients present. But osteoporosis, once you hit that, it's irreversible. You can't get it back. That's where females, estrogen plays a role on this. And I'm not going to get into all of this because I could go on a whole new tangent with it. But if you are interested, love to chat about it. Basically, what happens is the estrogen needs to be present in order for our bones to be able to be healthy. When menopause hits, we have a depletion in estrogen, a huge depletion to hardly anything. That estrogen then is going to play a role in increasing the risk of this osteoporosis. But if you do exercise like resistance training, like weightlifting, that can reverse the effects of it, because now you're putting mechanical stress. So you got to have at least the estrogen present. If you don't, you got to have some mechanical stress to be able to offset that. Oh, Melanie, that's so cool. You worked with an endocrinologist. That's perfect, because the other side of endocrinology on it is eating disorders. So it usually is seen in females. I'm not going to say males do not go through it, right? Because males totally can go through eating disorders as well. But we look at anorexia as being one of the larger contributors to this osteoporosis. Let me give you an example of these fractures. If you were to have your grandma fall down, more likely she may fracture her wrist or her hip. But if you were to have, let's say, someone who has an eating disorder, they could go and they can jump on something and fracture their femur. Like, that's how dependent this estrogen and our intake can be on these conditions like osteoporosis. So that's super, super important. Here we have just an image of what a normal bone looks like, osteoporotic bone right there. Okay, so you can see it's starting to break apart. It's not good when you get to that state. And even too, like, let's say that you had osteoporosis because of an eating disorder early on, you cannot reverse this. You can only try to make it stronger by building new bone, but you will still have this risk of fractures like that. Okay, I'll stop there. From here on out, 43 and on, you have all the clinical applications. I highly recommend you just checking it out. We also have classifications based off of bones and what they look like. All right. Okie dokie. Thank you all for being there. My lab students, I know that we have our lab exam here coming right on up. I'm going to extend the time a few more minutes for you because I got too excited about this stuff, and we made it through. I hope the pace was a little bit better for you. I know quite a few mentioned going really fast, so I hope this pace was a little better. But yeah, we made it through. And happy Thursday for those of you I will not see tonight in lab. Your lecture quiz skeletal system is going to be due Saturday by 5:30. It opens up tomorrow, 5:30 p.m. You'll have 24 hours to do it. Also, too, lab quiz will be due roughly same time. Okay, so I will see you all next week. Have a great weekend. Woo! You made it through week 3. Booyah!
Hey, Danny.